Welcome everyone to the TLGS 2024 conference. My name is Wendy Doucette from East Tennessee State University, and I'll be moderating today's presentation. I will also be collecting questions in the chat. I'll now turn it over to our presenter who will discuss Accessing the Intangible, an exploratory qualitative study of how pivotal sources affect doctoral students' research thinking.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm happy to be here. I'm excited to share some unpublished findings from my research study. And I'll just say, starting off, that because my study is focused on I think someone's mic is unmuted. Because my study is focused on the research thinking of graduate students, I will be sharing some of my research thinking in a somewhat candid way as I throughout this presentation. So here we go. All right. Sorry. Got two monitors here. All right. My name is Kelly Hangauer. I'm the Education Psychology Librarian at the University of Iowa. And I've been at Iowa for about 5 years, been an academic librarian for about 7 years, and I do have a background in music and an interest in the creative process generally, and you'll see how that plays out in my research. So the initial spark for my research study was actually stems from a Transforming Libraries for Graduate Students conference in 2020 that got canceled. And for this presentation, I looked at this idea of research as a creative endeavor, and I dove into the higher education literature around creativity in doctoral programs and found, while they weren't talking about libraries or librarians, there were a lot of synergies between the two related to academic support groups, affective aspects of research, literature review, research as nonlinear, and metacognition. And so based on this idea of research as a creative endeavor, I submitted a proposal to the Institute for Research Design Librarianship, which I'll refer to as IRDL. And this is the summer 2022 that I got accepted, and I participated in it along with about 25 other librarians. And this was held online. And over 2 weeks, I received a crash course on social science research methods from experts in the field, and we workshopped our research ideas. And this was a fantastic experience for me, and I highly recommend IRDL for anyone who's interested. In addition to the workshops, for a year afterwards, received support from the cohort, guidance from IRDL organizers, and mentorship from a fantastic mentor who had also gone through the program. So shortly after the IRDL workshop, I had to submit a revised research proposal, and this was intended to set me up for the IRB process and to really clarify my study. In doing this, I took a deep dive into 3 distinct literatures that I will discuss briefly here. Because I was interested in creativity, I dug into the psychology of creativity literature. And there is a ton of research on this. And more specifically, I was drawn to the study of scientific creativity, which simply put, looks at the creative process of eminent scholars whose creativity is unquestioned. A great example of this is Howard Gruber's book-length study of Charles Darwin's thought process that he analyzed through a journal, daily journals and diaries and letters as Darwin was developing theory of evolution. And one thing the psychology literature brought to my attention, and one big takeaway for me, was the importance of insight in the creative process. I also engaged with the higher education literature, as mentioned earlier, and I was especially inspired by a newer book, which is called Creativity and Research from scholars at Stanford. And they focus on the idea of creative confidence, so how to promote creative confidence in graduate researchers. And they propose that creative thinking is a skill that can be developed and can be taught. Lastly, I dove into the library and information science literature, which brought my attention to the wonderful research out there on how we as librarians understand the research needs, habits, and social networks of graduate students, especially the emotional aspects of research. And especially, there's a tendency to look at the negative emotional aspects of research. But it also became clear to me that LIS has only minimally looked at the topic of creativity. All right, so all of this literature informed sort of a nascent theoretical framework and informed my study design. So let's get into the study itself. This is my study overview. And what I was trying to do, so my overall goal is understand the experience of doctoral research as a creative endeavor. And I have a number of objectives and a number of research questions. But what I was really trying to do, when I would draw your attention to right now, is how I was taking an interdisciplinary approach. So I'm engaging with a higher education perspective that looks at doctoral research as a creative endeavor. I am looking at the psychology of creativity literature that emphasizes the role of insight. And I am grounding all this in the bibliographies of students with a focus on pivotal sources or authors that's reflective of the LIS research. And initially, my research questions were very much focused on the cognitive and affective aspects of insight. So drawing a bit on Koltow's ISP, the information search process. But I was very interested in insight, but this ended up changing, and you'll see how this changed in the course of this presentation. So in my recruitment email, I did say there was the focus on insight in the research process, but what I was actually doing was asking graduate students to describe 3 to 5 sources in their bibliography that have been particularly influential or that represented key turning points in their research thinking. So I wasn't explicitly asking about insight, and rather I was getting the story of sources. And for some reason, this cup of oolong tea makes me think of story of sources. It's a relaxing image for me. All right, so let's get into the methods. I knew I wanted to conduct a qualitative study that used in-depth interviews. I was very much influenced by the connection between creativity and doctoral research. And so my population was doctoral students in the social sciences, with a focus on those who had completed their comprehensive exams, so out of coursework and in the independent part of their studies. I relied on departmental administrators to get the word out to graduate students, and I ended up recruiting 11 PhD students, 10 post-comps, 1 pre-comps. You'll see that it's mostly in education, 1 sociology, 1 in psychology. And interviews were held over Zoom and lasted between 45 minutes to an hour and a half. I used Otter AI to create transcripts, and coding I was excited to use in vivo, but ended up having many issues with it and was frustrated with in vivo. So we can talk about that at some other time if you want. So to analyze the data, I drew on thematic analysis. So essentially, I systematically read through the transcripts multiple times. I took notes and created codes. Eventually, codes were collated into themes that represented patterns in the data and cross-checked with the broader data set. And initially, I was doing this inductively, which means that I was trying to let the data speak for itself, and I was trying not to impose sort of any theoretical framework on it. And I was coding at the semantic level, which means I was focused on analyzing, describing what was specifically said in the interviews. More specifically, I was following the tenets of reflexive thematic analysis from Braun and Clark. And they explain how reflexive thematic analysis procedures reflect the values of a qualitative paradigm, centering a researcher's subjectivity, organic and recursive coding processes, and the importance of deep reflection on and engagement with the data. So I got through many phases of my analysis and had developed quite a few themes. But at step 6, at the point of producing the report, is where I ran into some trouble. So at this point, I was wanting to analyze the themes and quotes and relate it back to the literature. But I realized that my theoretical framework was incomplete. And this was sort of inconvenient in a way, right? Because it made me basically question everything I was doing. I felt like I was losing direction. So I was at an impasse. And so what I needed to do was get back into the literature. So I wanted to refine my theoretical framework because this is what would allow me to contextualize and analyze the data. So let's get into it just a little bit. So after some ups and downs, hemming and hawing, I began looking more deeply at information behavior research. Information behavior is more on the information science side of LIS. and it's the study of how individuals perceive, seek, understand, and use information in various life contexts. And a lot of information behavior research is not in the academic setting, but can be found in a lot of other settings, including things like everyday information behavior. And I'll say that this book, sorry that it's realizing that that's a little too big there. This book, really liked it. That's why I made it so big. Was instrumental in giving me access to this world of research. They provided a great overview. I really appreciated how they broke everything down and pointed me to a lot of other authors to explore. And in looking into information behavior, I realized that my study was really getting at this idea of information use, or how students are using information. So let's talk a little bit more about that. One way to think about information use is tangible versus intangible use. Case and given explain, and they're drawing on a lot of other authors for this explanation, but they say it, I like how they explain it here. So they explain that exposure to information can result in at least two kinds of results: changes in knowledge of the recipient, which is conceptual or intangible, and application of the information to some task or decision, which would be instrumental or tangible. So obviously I'm interested in the changes in the way one thinks about their topic from the graduate research perspective. So this would fall under the intangible category. Information use, especially cognitive or intangible information use, is understudied in LIS. One exception I will highlight here is Ross Todd's 1999 article. Todd did a quasi-experimental study designed to chart changes in knowledge structures after adolescent girls were exposed to information on heroin. Based on the data, he created conceptual graph structures to represent knowledge change. So while my study is very different from Todd's, his theme actually, the themes he pulled out actually paralleled a lot of the themes that I had originally found inductively in my process. So when I read this article, I ended up revisiting some of my themes and clarifying them based on the work of Todd, which would be a more deductive. So when I say I took an inductive and deductive approach, that is how I did that. So I'm going to share some findings based on one research question. So how did pivotal sources affect participants' research thinking? And I just want to point out that I will be throwing around this phrase, research thinking. The highlight is off, apologies. And so while I think you probably know what that means, a brief definition is cognition. Is cognition related to the research process? So cognition from the APA dictionary is all forms of knowing and awareness, such as perceiving, conceiving, remembering, and reasoning, judging, imagining, and problem solving, that then relates to the research experience. Findings, all right. Hopefully the proportion's okay with all this stuff. I found that pivotal sources affected the good stuff here, right? The findings. The research, pivotal sources affected the research thinking of doctoral students in 6 major ways. Sources tended to clarify, expand, confirm, consolidate, validate, or challenge one's research thinking. And I'm going to go through these 6 themes pretty quickly. And the way I'm approaching it is by prevalence. So I'm starting with the most prevalent to the least prevalent, and I'll give a couple examples of each from my interview data. So to clarify, means to make a statement or situation less confused and more clearly comprehensible. And 10 participants described 23 sources that clarified some aspect of their research thinking, especially as it related to research direction, patterns in the literature, theoretical and methodological frameworks, and disciplinary language. So psychology PhD candidate number 1 highlighted a white paper that provided the primary statistical models for each of their dissertation aims. Initially, the student had encountered this paper, but wasn't sure if they could trust it. This was due to mixed messages in the literature and the fact that as a new PhD student, they had yet to get a good sense of the academic community. So when the student attended a conference, they observed that this was the paper everyone was saying to use. They describe how it was in that meeting that I was like, okay, I should feel very comfortable. All the big people that are on this paper are here, and all of their peers are here, and they are all saying to use this literally in person. Gaining this clarity allowed the student to move forward with their research. Education PhD candidate number 5 was also grappling with their methodology. They discussed an article that could be described as an insight experience. While in a discourse methods class and, quote, drinking from the fire hose with dense required readings, the student happened upon a supplementary reading that turned out to be the exact thing that they needed. Whereas they had been feeling overwhelmed, they recalled how in reading this article, I realized that it was absolutely the piece that I needed to help me understand how to do the work I needed to do. So it was just, from start to finish, like, yes, that's what I want to do, and that's how I want to do it, and that's the topic I want to do it on. This experience was described as God, re-energizing and totally motivating. They concluded by exclaiming how it was just an amazing moment. The theme of expand closely resembles what Todd described as getting a complete picture, in which the focus is placed on incorporating new information into one's knowledge structure. So in other words, the primary usefulness of the source was new knowledge. 10 participants described 22 sources that expanded their knowledge of some aspect of their research topic, especially as it related to methods, theory, terminology, and concepts. For some students, their knowledge was expanded in primarily a pragmatic way, such as education PhD candidate number 3, who described how an article really helped scaffold my understanding of my topic, gave me a lot of terminology to use. I could trace it forward and see who's been citing it. So yeah, it's really helped me understand this literature. Other researchers had more profound connections with sources that expanded their knowledge. Education PhD candidate number 1 discussed how they discovered a book in the library catalog that struck their interest. Upon checking it out, they read it back to front quickly and fell in love with this book because it was literally everything that I was thinking about. The book opened their eyes to the societal expectations faced by their study population. They also described how it was their first introduction to me-search or autoethnography, which made the research feel like it came from a place of knowing, like actually going through this. This was one of a few sources that caused a shift in the students' methodological approach to their study population. To confirm means to establish the truth or correctness of something previously believed, suspected, or feared to be the case, and parallels Todd's theme of get a verified picture. So 6 participants described 8 sources that confirmed some aspect of their research thinking, especially as it related to theory and methodology. Education PhD candidate number 7 had been feeling like the quantitative approach to their topic was not capturing the deeper urgency that they felt. When they encountered an article that took a qualitative approach to the study population, it confirmed their leanings towards qualitative research and brought up this, this fire, this passion, this urge about this is exactly why you're doing this work and it's important. In short, the source confirmed their belief that qualitative methods was the best approach for their topic. Psychology PhD candidate number 1 was drawn to the methodology in a scholarly article, but found that the approach proposed by the paper was a tough sell to his peers and faculty. The student explained how people had less faith in my idea at the time. They felt like it was a leap, and I was really speculating about how meaningful these measures could be in my interpretation of how best to use them. The sense of uncertainty was allayed when a subsequent paper was published, as it confirmed the student's interpretation of the paper. As they described it, this paper came out and I was like, look, exactly what I was thinking. The student received further confirmation when they interacted with the author at a poster presentation and ended up chatting for 2 hours. In relation to their first 2 sources, sociology PhD candidate number 1 described how a source confirmed a hunch about how they could approach their topic in an interdisciplinary way. They explained, I had this hunch that, like the theory, that the background I came from can help them expand their research a little bit more, but I don't really know how to articulate the words, and she did that for me. Moving right along, I apologize if I'm going pretty fast. The next theme is validate, which means to recognize or affirm the validity or worth of a person or their feelings or opinions, or cause a person to feel valued or worthwhile. 6 participants described 7 sources that validated their research thinking. Oftentimes, validation came up in the early phases of the student's project. Education PhD candidate number 2 described the importance of finding someone who had done similar research. They explained how, at least for me, there's always a thing in my head of is this even worth spending? Is this dissertation worthy? I don't know, I've never done this before. So coming across this article was like, yeah, somebody thought that this was worthy of study, so it probably is in your field too. Education PhD candidate number 7 also grappled with the worthiness of their research. It was in an independent study that they came across an article that reflected their thinking. This source made it so that they were not having to convince, faculty that what I'm trying to do is impossible. Laughs. Lastly, early in their program, Education PhD candidate number 5 had decided on an interdisciplinary topic, but struggled to see how their topic would play out within the discipline of education. It was at this early phase of their research that they attended a conference and, quote, stumbled into a session in which the presenters were discussing their topic head on. The student exclaimed how the author's work was pivotal in giving me, permission is the wrong word, but validation, motivation, sort of an invitation into the work. And so it's partly the work that she was doing, but it's partly who she was as a scholar. This interaction, quote, sparked, unquote, the students' first publication and introduced them to a new research community. Consolidate. A cognitive theme number 5 is to combine a number of things into a single, more effective whole. 6 participants described 6 sources that helped consolidate disparate thoughts or bring together disparate sources. Education PhD candidate number 2 described an insight experience with an article that ended up being the theoretical framework for their dissertation. As a first-year doctoral student, they initially saw the article as helpful, but did not fully appreciate its novelty or understand its contribution to the literature. It was later in the program, during a theory course, that they re-encountered this piece in a different way that suddenly was illuminating things that they had seen in their literature review and brought things together in a way they had struggled to. They elaborated. I do remember just kind of feeling like a bunch of puzzle pieces clicked together, or like I had put on a new pair of glasses where disparate threads that I had been trying to bring together suddenly were fitting together, and for the first time feeling much more confident or clearer about where my dissertation might go. I felt like I just sort of had these disparate ideas, and this was the thing that brought them together that felt really clarifying. Education PhD candidate number 5 also described an experience of consolidation that could be characterized as an insight experience. In a prior research paper, they realized that there was a formula to the narratives that they were studying. This finding was not the main point of the research paper, but it stuck with them. During this time, the student was reading, quote, for fun, unquote, all the collected readings of a particular theorist that they had been introduced to in a class, and they continued to pursue this theorist because they, quote, just liked it, unquote. While reading, the student came across a theoretical concept that resonated with them. Upon reading, they remarked, oh crap, because they realized that the narrative structure that I'd been seeing and struggling with was absolutely a mirror of what the theorist was talking about and the consequences of that. Seeing this connection was huge in my and then gestures ahead explosion. This source gave them the tools they needed to explain the patterns in their data, thereby sparking their next project and inspiring a new coding scheme. All right, last theme here. Sometimes new knowledge had the ability to challenge established knowledge structures, causing a sense of cognitive disequilibrium. 4 participants described 7 sources that challenged some aspect of their research thinking. Education PhD candidate number 9 discussed a methods book that was required in multiple courses that had a profound impact on how they thought about quantitative methods. They explained how they struggled really hard to make sense of it because it challenged the post-positivist paradigm of their math and science background and created a real tension. They explained how sitting with some of these deeper philosophical questions was kind of challenging and led to what they described as an ontological crisis. Over time, the student eventually gained clarity as to details of the author's arguments and learned to sit with the tension. Earlier, we looked at some examples of students who felt validated in their research thinking when they found a similar study. But sometimes finding a similar study had the opposite effect. For example, after months of figuring out how to bridge 2 disciplines to address the research question, sociology PhD candidate number 1 discovered a source that was very similar to their research. They remarked, yeah, with this one, I definitely have worries. I was like, do I still need to study this if other people have already done the work? To overcome this worry, the student described the importance of talking to a faculty mentor from another university and came to realize that their research was indeed important and that replication was okay. Whew. Okay, that was a lot. And we're returning to this idea of story of sources. We'll look at this beautiful cup of oolong tea for a second. So I just have some concluding thoughts because I'm still in the process of working on this and analyzing the data. And there's other findings that I'm not sharing here today that I want to talk about in a paper. So I just want to say, as I analyzed my data, I realized that what I was capturing and what I wanted to represent was the story of sources. Indeed, each source revealed a complex web of thought processes, social networks, feelings, and actions. And a lot of the times the sources were connected to each other. So, a student maybe talked about 4 sources and they had this really interesting relationship with each other or built on each other. Furthermore, I learned that by looking at pivotal sources specifically, we are not always getting necessarily inside experiences, although they do come up, but we are uncovering the research thinking of students in a way that emphasizes the joyous side of research, if you will. All too often, I feel like in LIS, we focus on the kind of those negative emotional aspects of graduate research, which are totally valid, and there are many, but I also think it's important to get a better idea of some of the more profound and perhaps beautiful moments of graduate research that may be difficult to access unless you ask the right questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Kelly. I don't have a long list. Oops. Am I still unmuted?
No, I can hear you.
Okay. I don't have a long list of articles I'm looking forward to reading, but I am looking forward to this one. Um, I think you're right in that we so undervalue the epiphany and the importance of it for validation, for motivation, for getting people to go forward. And I'm tempted to ask, excuse me, if you ask students what these titles were and if you're keeping a list of them, and the reason I hesitate to ask is because epiphanies are individualized. So did you come across anything where you said, wow, these seem to be really sparking people?
Like particular authors or sources? No, it was all over the place. Very much all over the place. And I have a pretty small sample size, right? It's 11 students. And maybe if you did this across 100, education PhD students, maybe you'd start to see some patterns there. But no, this was very individualized, personalized to the students. I did keep track of the sources, but I am obscuring the sources because I feel like that can lead to de-anonymizing the data. Does that make sense?
Yes, it does. In the chat, Jess is thanking you for sharing your coding and analysis process, and she says it's hard to communicate, but it helped to understand your findings. And Hannah agrees about frustration with NVivo.
Yeah, it costs a lot of money and it really doesn't have great features at all. It's like every step of the way there's a technical difficulty. So
we have possibly 1 minute if anyone wants to ask a question in the chat. Rebecca says that she's reminded of her frustration with the simplistic categorization of citations into positive and negative that some of the basic citation apps like Cite do. There's much more that we can learn about why things influence research.
Yeah, I think that's a good point.
How did the students feel about talking to you about this? Were they happy to have the opportunity to finally say, wow, something, I mean, for somebody to go, I feel like they're
Yeah.
ready to talk about this.
There definitely was an aspect of that. I ran into some of the students afterwards, and they're they said they were talking to some of their peers, and they're saying how much they enjoyed having that time to talk about their research thinking and really reflect on it, because sometimes you don't get that opportunity to reflect on how this source affected you. Yeah, they said it was a really, really great and helpful experience. So yeah, it's an interview, collecting data, and it's also perhaps some research therapy.
For you and for them too.
Yes, exactly.
Thank you so much for presenting for this session with the 2024 TLGS conference. We appreciate you sharing your research insight with us.